Welcome back to MACNA 2020 Phoenix Rising. I'm Kevin Erickson, MACNA president, and today and right now I have the honor of introducing you to Dr. Liz Marchio. Liz is a social science studying ways in which the aquarium hobby affects participants' views and understanding of science and conservation. This passion stemmed from her personal history as a serious aquarist, one that shaped her interest in ichthyology and environmental science. Liz's experience as an aquarist spans many facets, including as a technician at several Columbus, Ohio local fish stores, as secretary and member at large for the Columbia area fish enthusiast, as a guest speaker to freshwater aquarium clubs across the United States, and as a forum member and most recently a MACNA graduate scholarship recipient in 2015. Her PhD research utilized the views of MACNA 2017 attendees through interviews and a review of science and conservation content in the exhibitor hall. Today, Liz will be presenting The Art of Aquarium Keeping, Communicates Science and Conservation. Welcome to MACNA 2020, Liz.
Thank you, Kevin, for having me. Again, my name is Liz Marchio, and I'm going to talk to you about some research that I've done on the aquarium hobby. Now, as you can see, this is a freshwater tank, but most of what I'm going to talk to you about has to do with the saltwater aquarium hobby, so hopefully you stay tuned and stay interested. And what I found with both hobbies, the aquarium hobby being freshwater and saltwater, is that the artistic element of keeping an aquarium can communicate science and conservation to the person who's participating. So as Kevin said, a little bit about me. I worked for multiple different fish shops from the year 2000 when I graduated high school all the way to 2010. At that point, I went back to school because I actually dropped out. I ended up earning my bachelor's degree in zoology, and then I earned a master's of biological sciences, specifically ichthyology. Now this may seem like, why do you need to know all my credentials? But my credentials have a lot to do with the topic, so just hang with me. And then I earned my PhD in recreation, parks, and tourism sciences. Basically, I studied leisure sciences. Believe it or not, you can study leisure. Currently, I'm a partner with the National Park Service, working as a citizen science coordinator at the only national park in New Orleans called John Lafitte National Historical Park and Preserve. And the unit of the national park I work for is called Barataria Preserve. It is south of New Orleans, if you can believe that there's a south of New Orleans. And it is swamp, and there I take kids from K through 12 out on the bayou, literally and figuratively, through virtual programming, and adults, we do education outdoors. So it's a great job, and that's what I do for the Park Service. Now, how I got there and how I got to be a scientist and a PhD began life as an aquarist. And then I somehow became an ichthyologist. So when I started doing my PhD, I was really curious as to how I got to be a scientist, because I fully understood that I became an ichthyologist because I was interested in fishes. And I wasn't someone who went outside and went fishing. I mean, I did as a kid, but that wasn't an integral part of me growing up. What was integral to me was aquarium. And so what I think got me my master's degree, besides a lot of hard work, was the interest in fish from a very, I guess you could say casual beginning, not professional at all, dabbling with something in my own home. And what ended up happening is I started studying the aquarium hobby and aquarium keeping. And this is a paper that stems directly from the research that I did for my PhD. This also tracks pretty much exactly with this talk. So if you're interested in this talk, you can take a picture of this QR code at the bottom. It's an open access paper, it's free. I intentionally wrote it so that people who are not necessarily professional scientists can understand it. And it is open access, like I said, because I want to make sure everyone who wants to read science articles can read them. Sometimes there's a paywall, and that's annoying. This one, no paywall. So feel free to download it and follow along. So why do I study aquarium keeping? Well, the end result after this paper that I wrote, and the information I'm presenting to you in this talk today, is that 96% of all, it's in the 96th percentile of all journal articles in the Journal of Frontiers in Communication. So this one topic about aquarium keeping and the artistic and conservation orientations and scientific orientations of the aquarium keepers is very interesting to a lot of people, because 96th percentile means that It is a very popular paper in the entire journal. And I'm not saying that to toot my own horn, although it's nice that that is happening. That means that a lot of people are interested in this topic, and which keeps my motivation going, because that means more than likely a lot of aquarists are reading this paper as well. So why I'll study aquarium keeping? Well, the pet industry in the United States is a very strong economic industry, at least until COVID. You know, let's just say everything that I have to say, take COVID with a grain of salt. I'm not going to talk about the COVID situation. So up until the COVID situation, the pet expenditures in the United States were very high. Well, they weren't necessarily high, but they were increasing through time. So as you can see in this graph, the graph goes from left to right, it goes up. That means there's a positive correlation between these two variables, which means that as time goes on, the expenditures increase. So each year, Americans are spending more and more on their pets. So it's a very strong economic industry, the aquarium and pet industry is. Also, a lot of people keep fish, more than you think. A lot of people are like, well, do you like cats or dogs more? The real question is, why aren't you keeping a fish? Because freshwater fish are actually the #1 kept pet in the United States, at least up until 2016 when this data was collected. Freshwater fish are found in 54.4 million households in the United States. That is the #1 fish, or #1 pet in America. Saltwater fish rank 6th at 4.9 million households. So, you know, that's not as many as freshwater, but together they absolutely blow everyone else out of the water as far as pets go. So there's a lot of households that own fish, and there's a lot of fish that are owned by households. So the next graph down says number of pets owned in the United States in millions. Freshwater fish, again, #1. 95.5 million fish are owned by people in the United States. Now that kind of makes sense because you can have multiple fish in a fish tank, multiple fish in a household then. Now the upper graph is way more interesting because it's telling us the number of households that own pets. And if 54.4 million households own a freshwater fish, what else goes with a freshwater fish? You don't just have a fish in your house, right? You have it in a fish tank. You have a heater in there. You feed it food. You change the water out. So just having a fish also means that you're providing an entire ecosystem for that organism, and that also adds to the economic impact of the aquarium hobby and the pet industry. So the pet industry is kind of driven a lot by freshwater and saltwater fishes. They just aren't necessarily the iconic pets that we think of. And then we have saltwater fishes are important to study, and freshwater. Saltwater, because more than 90% of the fishes, the vertebrates, are wild caught. Now this data is from, I think, 2015, so that could be a little bit different. Freshwater fish is about 10% of fishes are wild caught. Now we want to study the aquarium trade because when you're trading fishes that are wild, that means that you're actually in the wildlife trade. Now aquarium fishes kind of have flown under the radar for various reasons. So they're not necessarily thought of as wildlife, but they are, and this will soon catch up to us. So we have to pay attention to what we're doing with the organisms because we're not very well regulated at this point as a hobby. So why else study aquarium keeping? Well, for me, it's personal. I have personal history as a hobbyist, and as many of you probably know, you get very attached to the hobby and to the organisms. You get your favorite fish, you got your favorite locations, where these fishes come from, perhaps, favorite coral, all sorts of things that you kind of get attached to. So I have a pretty strong attachment to the hobby, and I already knew that there were things going on that I could study because I was already embedded in it as an aquarist. I was a community member. It is also an understudied wildlife trade, as I had already mentioned. There are many papers that have come out talking about transparency issues, meaning that we don't know what fish are being exported and imported into certain locations because they're not identified correctly or not identified at all. So there's issues with transparency and collecting, and there are a number of various other things with the saltwater aquarium hobby. So it's good to study those so we can understand what those issues are and opportunities to improve. Has nothing to do with good or bad. It's just saying what in time can we improve on and what do we need to pay attention to. And the aquarium hobby itself is an understudied leisure activity. I don't think anyone else has studied it besides aquarists themselves without the credentials to put it out there for other people to read it in a scientific journal. So I'm going to give you some pictures here of different participation styles in the saltwater aquarium hobby, and pay attention to what you're looking at and what is visible. So in this tank, what do you see? You see, well, you see a lot of blue for one, and the blue light ends up bringing out a lot of the reflective coloration of the corals. That kind of brings in the scientific aspect, because you wouldn't know that unless you have kept corals for a while. But that's besides the point at this point in the talk. What we're looking at is a very aesthetically pleasing aquarium. The point of keeping an aquarium is to make it so that it is nice to look at. So this one is dominated by SPS corals. This one is a little bit better mix. Interesting choices of color in this one because they've chose a lot of red and orange. Not necessarily that common to see that in these big tank photos. Very attractive, so very visually attractive. Again, color, we're looking at eye-popping color. These happen to be more species-specific aquaria, which is kind of rare in the marine aquarium hobby from my understanding. So we got Scolamia up in this upper left-hand tank, and these are all from Ecotech Marine, these photos. Then we have a zoanthid tank with some blastomusa in there, if you can find it. And so it's pretty species-specific, but still very oriented towards color, right? That's what you're paying attention to when you're looking at these boxes of water, is you're paying attention to the color first. And also you're paying attention to where these aquaria are in the space. So sometimes you just pay attention to just the aquarium and the organisms, but a lot of other people work that aquarium into an aesthetically pleasing spot in their house and make it into an aesthetically pleasing thing to have as a whole, not just what's inside of it. So aesthetics play a huge role in the aquarium hobby. And I also was interested in the scientific component of aquarium keeping, because as an aquarist, I knew that I was only successful in keeping fish alive if I understood science, like the nitrogen cycle. Now, for a hobby to be good at communicating science, there has to be a few things. They must elicit a personal response, first of all. So a personal response could be like that attachment I was talking about. So you have your fish tank, you get attached to the organisms, and once that attachment happens, you're going to be more interested in what happens to those organisms and what they're doing, what, you know, like what is that clownfish doing? Why is that little one shaking at the big one? You know, that type of curiosity is starting to get piqued when you have a fish tank. So you're going to get this kind of a personal response as well. You're going to get attached to these organisms and want to find out more about them. So it's going to, this personal response raises awareness. It also increases your enjoyment, which is quite nice. It kind of strokes your interests, and it forms new opinions and experiences and promotes understanding. So communicating science, we expect all of these things to happen, that there be a personal response. In the associated aquarium hobbyist, we think that they're getting some science through the aquarium hobby. There has to be first a personal response, and then awareness and enjoyment of all those other aspects. And then hopefully we create people, wow, that love fish, whether they be freshwater or saltwater, big or small. So what I've just given you is the introduction, and I'm going to format the rest of this talk as a scientific talk. Now, I don't want this to be dry and boring because, you know, this is not a scientific conference, but I'm framing this as a scientific talk. For one, this research project is attainable to do for undergraduates or grad students. So if you're an undergraduate or grad student interested in research, you can kind of follow along and see how I did this. And I'm also interested in showing you the ways I did that so you understand how science works in a social science type of realm, because social science isn't necessarily well known. We study humans and we study values and beliefs. So I'm going to kind of go into that just to bring you up to speed a little bit, hopefully not boring you too much. So research outline, we already did the introduction where I told you all about, you know, why I'm studying what I'm studying. Next, I'm going to go into the methods and the analyses. And then I'm going to go into the results, which is notoriously the more interesting part. And I'm going to tease you here about them, as I'd already kind of teased you already. The results are that there's an aesthetic value of the ecosystem and of the organisms. Now that means the aquarium and the organisms in the aquarium. There's also science communication that occurs to participants while they're participating, but it is latent. That means that the participants don't necessarily know that they're learning science. And so I'm talking about all of you. You're participating in the aquarium hobby and you're actually doing science. You just might not realize it. So I'm going to try to tease that out a little bit just so that you can kind of see where that's coming from. And then also I found that there's a conservation ethic that is promoted in participants in the aquarium hobby, although there are differences between freshwater and saltwater participants. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. So the methods that I used. Now for social science, a lot of times it's not as old of a science as the natural sciences. So we base a lot of our research on qualitative studies first. Qualitative studies mean that we look at qualities and words. It's kind of a subjective approach, but we do very in-depth descriptions of the social worlds, like aquarium keepers. We're like anthropologists, essentially. And so we interview people about their participation, for example, in the aquarium hobby, and then pull out different themes and so on, because no one's really studied this before, so we don't really have anywhere that we know to start. Other types of science can be done using quantitative approaches. Quantitative is the quantification or measurement. Now, I can't do measurements with this study because it hasn't been done before. I don't know what would be useful to measure. So basically, this research is setting the groundwork and foundation for me to understand what I can do later to quantify what's going on in the aquarium hobby and maybe what's more interesting and what I want to pay attention to. So hopefully that makes sense, that there's two different ways you can do your methods: qualitative data collection and quantitative data collection. You're going to get two different types of data and you interpret them differently. So what you're going to see from me is a lot of interpretation of words. You're not going to see a lot of numbers. Hopefully that's a good thing. So the methods that I use include ethnography. Again, think of this as an anthropologist. What I'm doing is I'm going into the social world of aquarium keeping. So I've attended MACNA conferences for this research, where I completely immerse myself in the lives, the culture, and the situation that I'm studying, which is really easy because I liked it. I'm an aquarium hobbyist, so why wouldn't I want to go schmooze with a bunch of aquarists? So this is kind of a nice project for me. But if you look at this picture here, it's going to show you the methods of how to do an ethnography. You ask ethnographic questions, you collect data, you make a record, you analyze that data, and you do it all again, and again, and again, and again. So as I'm collecting data, I'm constantly doing this repetitive, asking more questions, collecting more data, making a record, analyzing it, and then if I need more data, I collect more. So this is a very long-term study. It took seven years. It's a lot. But you have to do this in order to get scientifically valid data. So this is one of the methods that I use to collect qualitative data. It's systematic and flexible. It lets the things that are happening in the social world with aquarists actually emerge, and it's recognizable that way. It asks me, the researcher, to participate in aquarium keeping for a sustained period of time and doing ideally 3 different modes of data collection. So participant observation, content analyses, and interviews. So those are the 3 ways I collected data, and this data were collected in a qualitative way, using words, not numbers. So to dig a little deeper, I did participant observation. It's exactly what it sounds like. It's observing as a participant. So I was an aquarist. I went to aquarium stores. I went to aquarium conferences, frag swaps, everything that I could possibly go to. Made a lot of notes, looked at conservation content of anybody there. So if it was a vendor, I'd look at their vendor materials, like a little booklet or whatnot, and see what they're looking or what they're saying that has to do with science and conservation, if anything. Sometimes there wasn't. So that was some type of participant observation I was doing. I was also doing content analyses. So if you're someone who's on NanoReef or Reef Central or Reef to Reef online forums, I did a lot of research on those, so you might be in there. Well, specifically, I looked at Tank of the Month threads, because Tanks of the Month are spectacular ways to look at the pinnacle of reef keeping, because basically the entire social world of, like, say, nanoreef.com, they all vote on who they think the best nano reef is of that month. And so by looking at the Tanks of the Month, I'm able to look at the pinnacle of participation in the hobby during that 1 month. And the really cool thing too is that Tanks of the Month have been going on for years and years. So if you go back and look at 10 years ago, you're going to see some really interesting differences in participation style. But looking at the content of forums and magazines, that I can look at places where participants get their information and find themes of what they are and what they're taking in. Like, this is the food that's feeding their hobby. What are they feeding their brain? And third, I also did interviews at MACNA, specifically the one in New Orleans, and did a lot of interviews. I think I did 17 interviews. And when you're doing interviews, you only do enough to get repetitive answers. So when I was interviewing people, if the last interviewee was saying the same thing that the other ones were, like why they're keeping the aquarium, what kind of science is oriented to them in the aquarium. If I kept getting the same answers, I stopped data collecting. So remember that circle of data collection? I was collecting and collecting and collecting. I got to stop when it hit theoretical saturation, is what it's called. Took a while. So here's some photos from participant observation. I participated as an aquarist. So I set up a nano reef because I wanted to set up a nano reef for a while. And because I think most aquarists are interested in specs, I'll tell you the specs of the tank. It was a 8-inch by 8-inch by 8-inch cube. I actually found it in the trash. Someone threw it away. I don't know why. So I drilled a hole in the back and made a drain pipe down to a 10-gallon sump. And yes, I had a 2.5-gallon tank with a 10-gallon sump because I've always wanted to do that. I think it's ridiculous to have a teeny display tank and a huge sump, but I did it anyway. So here's my little teeny reef tank. I was doing a water change at this point. And I also was doing everything I thought that you're supposed to do as a reef aquarium keeper. So I was testing water regularly, going to stores, talking to people, getting information, all sorts of stuff. So I was trying to be just a usual reef keeper. So one of the analyses for participant observation and content analysis, and well, all of them, is to review all of them and distinguish any common themes. So this essentially just means review, 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 and pulling out anything that piques your interest and that is common over all three data collection methods: the interviews, the content, and the participation. Then I constantly compared everything. Again, same thing, that circular methods. I wrote notes and memos, and then again, theoretical saturation is when I got to stop collecting data. Round and round in a circle, multiple years. So remember, if you want to be a scientist, it takes a lot of time and work. It's worth it though. So here are the results. The different themes are basically what I told you before. And I'm going to go into a little more detail with this. First is that aquarists who keep a marine tank have a very high aesthetic value oriented to that marine aquarium. It may be that they started out keeping the aquarium because of its aesthetic value, or maybe they grew into the aesthetic value and wanted it, later on. And that the aquaria and their inhabitants are visually attractive. So when I say aesthetics, I'm really talking about just looking with your eyeballs. So this kind of brings up an interesting question, like, would a blind person appreciate a marine aquarium? I kind of doubt it, unless they like the noise. But if a blind person may not like a marine aquarium because they can't see it, that kind of just supports that this is a very aesthetic hobby. And science in the marine aquarium hobby is communicated latently. Latent means that you don't know it's happening. It's just happening and you're picking up on it, and this information is accumulating over time. So aquarists learn science without knowing. And I'll give you a couple examples. Lastly, there's an emergent conservation ethic where I think what happens is that the aquarists bond with the organisms that they're keeping, and they want to learn more about them. And some people even said they would like to go visit their brethren in the wild. And sometimes it's not like I want to go visit a clownfish. Sometimes I love my clownfish and I want to go see a whale shark in the wild. Sometimes that is the type of leap that we're making. I don't know how conservation ethical that is, conservation ethics that is, to see a whale shark. But if you're giving money to the right people who are, making their livelihoods in a good way, then it's probably a conservation appropriate behavior. Just not necessarily with the aquarium organisms. So here's some of the results for aesthetic value, just to give you some evidence that supports what I'm saying. So this person is this quote here is from a Tank of the Month in August 2006. It says, in their opinion, the technical equipment should be inobtrusive, hidden and quiet, and that should just work and not be too bells and whistles type of thing is what they were getting at. Essentially, they said that they wanted to have an in-wall design. Now, an in-wall design would mean that you're putting your aquarium in a wall. It could be a wall that you see from one angle, or it could be a wall that you see from the back and the front. Either way, this is a very aesthetic thing to say. A wall aquarium is very reminiscent of a picture hanging on a wall. And this person said, for purely aesthetic purposes, the aquarium needed to have no visible pumps and equipment. The focus they wanted on the organism. So they basically are, if you're thinking about what they're saying, they want a slice of the ocean in their home that's visible on the wall as a rectangle, as a picture almost. Maybe not everyone feels that way, but these are some of the common themes. One of the interviewees said that a lot of people think it's a picture that you can just hang on a wall and you can set it up and forget about it. It doesn't work like that. And so I thought this was interesting because people who have been in the aquarium hobby for some time say this. It's not new people. So we think maybe it's the new people who are coming into the hobby thinking it's just a picture they can hang on the wall, and maybe they aren't putting as much thought into what organisms they're putting into their aquarium, which is not good for our conservation ethic collectively in the hobby. So it seems as though aesthetics are very visual and it is a very strong driver. And even taken to another level, some people think of an aquarium as a picture that moves. So I call it a moving picture. Another interest in aesthetics has to do with movement and shape. So it's not always just color. So someone said that they selected particular fish based on their different color, shape, and patterns. This was from a beginner's forum on a reef forum. And another person I interviewed, they said that they're most interested in movement in the tank. So they've selected coral, like soft coral that wave around, not like your colorful sticks that are sticks. No offense, but she's more interested in the movement. Now, as you see from these two sources, beginner forum and someone who's less than a year in the hobby, that movement is an aesthetic value, but it is not something that people who are long-term in the hobby seem to seek out. So maybe movement is something that new people in the hobby really go after. Either way, it's still aesthetic and it still has to do quite a bit with what I'm talking about. But it is interesting that there might be differences between newcomers and the older folks in the hobby as to what aesthetics they're interested in. So science communication, as I said, it is latent, meaning that most aquarists who are in the hobby don't necessarily know how much science they're actually learning. And I'm not saying like you're learning one scientific thing, you're learning a lot. And you're not only just learning like facts, you're actually applying them. Because if you don't apply something as scientific as the nitrogen cycle, you don't have a fish tank. And so you can't be a participant anymore. So you have to know certain scientific elements that happen in your aquarium in order to succeed. That's why it's latent. You're not saying, well, I guess maybe now people are saying you have to understand the nitrogen cycle and it's science and you have to know science to be in the hobby. I don't think people are saying it and phrasing it and framing it like that. You're just learning about science as you go. Another good example is just buying a fish, frankly. When you look at a fish, what are you looking at? You're probably looking at the aesthetic value of it. Is it pretty? But later on, you're going to start wondering, can I keep it in the fish tank? You know, what does it need? How can I maintain this organism to the best of its ability? So what you're going to end up doing is accidentally learning about the biology, physiology, wild individuals, that, you know, what they do in the wild compared to what your organism does, your individual does. You're just going to dive real deep into things, and it'll be slightly scientific, and you're going to increase your scientific awareness, whether you know it or not. And like I said, if you participate in the aquarium hobby and you don't understand some of the basic scientific concepts, you're going to end up with no aquarium hobby. So that kind of tells us, it's evidence that science has to be integrated into the hobby somehow. And another scientific aspect is, again, the organisms and biodiversity. You know, what is a species even? Because a lot of species that we keep in the hobby, say specifically corals, they come in different color patterns. Now, just because they're different color patterns and they're different diversity in that aesthetic way, it doesn't mean they're necessarily a different species. So even though, you know, someone might say that eagle-eyed zoanthids are different than, honestly, I don't remember many names except for the terrible ones, like gorilla nipple zoanthids. So yeah, compare gorilla nipple zoanthids with eagle-eye zoanthids, and you're going to see, you know, anatomical differences. You're going to be paying attention to the skirt color, the tentacles, the mouth color of the zoanthid. I mean, you're going to learn about anatomical features of the coral just by surveying it and assessing its aesthetic value to you. And you're also going to understand later, at least, that zoanthids, even though they're very colorful and diverse, they're not all different species because of that. So you're kind of just picking up here and there little nuggets of information about science. And one of the quotes that had to do with science communication is the one here. It says, "In the years that followed, I became more and more accustomed to the tank's requirements." Sounds familiar, right? "And more information on stony corals became available to me." Now, this is an interesting quote, because what they're saying is that the more they've gotten into the hobby, the more they've found information about the hobby. So maybe that there's, I don't want to say gatekeeping going on in the aquarium hobby, but there's information that people don't seem to be getting until they hit a certain point. So I'm not sure exactly what's going on there. It would be worth looking at a little bit at a later point. Another scientific aspect of the aquarium hobby is genetics. Now, as aquarium breeding or aquarium fish breeding has become more and more popular, people are understanding that they can bring out certain attributes of the organism. So what started out as a 3-barred Ocellaris clownfish, or Nemo, has been selected artificially. Artificial selection is a scientific concept. So people are selecting different patterned clownfish and breeding them, and then breeding those, and you're selecting different color forms essentially. So this is genetics, very basic, maybe not basic genetics, but it is genetics. And then lastly, for the conservation ethic, what I ended up finding that I teased you about earlier is that there's a difference between freshwater and saltwater aquarists. So I found there's more than this, and there are saltwater aquarist conservation societies, I'm sure. They're not as easy to find for me as they are for freshwater. So these two I found for freshwater. The CARES program asks people to dedicate an entire tank to one species. Now, if you remember, I said that many marine aquarists don't keep species-only tanks. So this is going to be kind of a challenging conservation thing for many marine aquarists, unless you're really into one species. So their conservation ethic is a little bit different. They want you to breed fish in like a very specific environment and pass them that information along, or pass those fishes along to other people. Another conservation-oriented organization in the freshwater hobby is called Babes in the Cichlid Hobby. This is a female group of women. Well, I guess that makes sense. This is women who like the cichlid hobby. So they've picked out a certain species to pay attention to. So they're very species specific in their conservation. That, to my knowledge, hasn't happened in the marine aquarium hobby. There aren't necessarily social groups and organizations around certain species or certain groups of fish or certain groups of coral. I think that is actually happening more and more. So there's people who are more interested in like SPS corals or acropora, and they might end up congregating and being a social group compared to other people. But regardless of the groupings, that the marine aquarium hobby isn't going after conservation and trying to conserve the organisms like the freshwater hobby is. And it might not be to the same extent, and I have a very good excuse for the marine aquarium hobby for that. The freshwater hobby is old. It is long-term old. People have been keeping fish for a very long time in little teeny Chinese like bases, essentially. Saltwater has not been kept nearly as long. So we don't necessarily have the ability to do conservation like freshwater aquarists can do. We can't breed everything. We can't just pass things along like they do. There's other things that are going on. Now, there are organizations and institutes like the Marine Breeding Initiative who are people that are breeding very specific fishes and very specific tanks, and they're doing so to promote conservation, whether maybe they don't necessarily say that, but they're trying to make a more sustainable hobby, which is a conservation ethic. So there is conservation going on in the marine aquarium hobby. It's just not as clear cut and well defined as the freshwater hobby. And there is also an issue where the marine aquarium hobby it's global, and it's in areas that are a little challenging governmentally. So conservation sometimes will give money to government organizations to take care of the organisms on the ground, but I think there's an issue where we don't trust those countries necessarily to take care of it or use that money wisely. So there's a pretty big disconnect in how we can conserve saltwater organisms that we care about on reef systems. Something to think about. We can definitely make improvements. And so what I want to end this with, and I have a few more things to talk about, but just in general, you know, when you start in the aquarium hobby, you kind of just don't know where it's going to go. And this person said, little did they know it started off as a free fish tank and 2 clownfish, developed into a lifelong passion. So it's hard to say where the aquarium hobby is going to take you. Now, as I said before, for science communication to work, there has to be personal response, awareness, enjoyment, interests, opinion of informing experiences, and understanding. Now, I put this in here because I hope that, you know, maybe you'll reflect a little bit on what, you know, the hobby means to you. Are you aware that science is oriented into it? And also that there's a very underlying aesthetic value to the aquarium hobby that could help promote the scientific orientation as well. So we want some fish huggers, essentially. And also, if you remember this, the stats I put up about the number of households in the United States that own freshwater and saltwater fishes, when calculated out, that's 10% of the United States population. So 10% of people in the United States have an aquarium. That's a lot of people that can do very good things for the hobby. And they can develop and facilitate science and conservation that way, and increase even a conservation ethic and help, you know, maintain our hobby for a long term. And some people are using aquariums to actually teach children about science. So this does promote the scientific aspect of the research, that, you know, something as beautiful as an aquarium can be used to teach science, and do so at a level that even kids can understand. And these are 3rd graders in Illinois. And also defining science as a leisure activity. So what I mean by that is that the activity of aquarium keeping is a leisure activity, but it also is scientific. So it's a science as leisure activity. And we can distinguish, there's different turning points and career changes along the development of someone in this type of activity. So if you remember my scenario, I was a casual person dealing with science as an aquarist, and then I became a professional. But what could happen along the way is that there could be points that put up roadblocks. Now, by studying science leisure activities, we can potentially tease out what roadblocks come up in people's lives that keep them from going on to be a professional scientist. Now, if you're a scientist, you probably aren't interested in this because we have a lot of talk about how to keep people in science because we lose a lot of diverse viewpoints as they go through schooling. So we end up with a very homogenous group of people at the end who are doing science. So we need more different views in science. How do we do that? So like I said, there could be a roadblock in the way. And by studying casual participation, we might be able to see that this roadblock might have to do with something like gender, or it could have to do with location even. Because what I ended up finding in another portion of this study is that people from the Midwest and northern states, they are more serious, I guess you could say, at least in freshwater. They're more serious participants because they have the availability of space and temperature. A lot of people in the Midwest have basements. Now, this is something I didn't really think much about until I moved down south to New Orleans. There are no basements here. We don't have, the water table is too close to the actual surface of the ground to have a basement. So people who live in the upper states are able to have an entire space that's more temperature, I don't know, the better temperature for aquarium keeping. So if you have a basement, it stays more consistent. It's not going to get too hot or cold. So people in more northern states actually have a benefit if you're an aquarium keeper. So that's just an interesting aside because that could have to do with how the aquarium hobby trends throughout the United States and how the participation itself can trend. So maybe participants in the more southern states have difficulties going into scientific fields because they just can't participate in a leisure activity that involves science in a way that gets them to a point where they can go off into a professional level. Because science is a lot of knowledge and fact building. And if you can't build those facts before you make a choice in career, then you're not going to choose that career. It's kind of long-winded, but it's something to think about, and it is definitely ways that we can study the aquarium hobby in different aspects. Like that basement thing, I think that's pretty cool and interesting. And it's anecdotal at this point. I didn't like quantify how many basement dwellers have fish tanks and so on. But it is something that if someone else would like to do it, have at it. And with that, now I'm happy to end the talk, and hopefully you all have a lot of questions because, while this wasn't just, here's some fish, here's water quality, or, here's how to better your aquarium, like this is going to get you thinking about how you can better yourself and make your experience better as an aquarist. I hope. Thank you for joining me, and that's it.
Thank you very much, Liz. And if you guys want to ask questions to Dr. Marchio, you can go to macna.org/questions, and you can select her from the list of people there, type your question, fill out your information, and hit submit, and we will gather those questions for Liz for the Q&A at the end of the day. Liz, a quick question I have, how can people kind of follow in your footsteps? Do you have any advice for people who might want to go back to school now that they're kind of passionate aquarium hobbyists and learn more about this science and about marine aquariums in general?
Yeah, sure. So, what really pops out at me when you're asking this is, if you haven't gone to school for this and you're older, you can still go back to school. I got my PhD at 37 years old. Everyone else, not everybody else, but a lot of other people were 10 years younger than me. 10 years, that is a lot of years. And so, it wasn't necessarily that easy, but you can go back and do it, especially if you have a passion, because that's really what gets you through school. If you don't have the passion, you're just there to party, yeah, you're not going to go very far. So even though I missed out on like 10 years of education, I still ended up with a PhD. So you never know. You just kind of have to be passionate and dedicated and go after it.
Well, it's been good to watch you along the way. And like I said in the introduction, Liz has been, or rather is a MACNA graduate scholarship recipient, and then she's been present at many MACNAs now, sitting amongst the poster area and around the exhibitor area, surveying away. So it's good to see the conclusion of that research, and hopefully, possibly some more. Your current role, I know, is more interactive with students and the public, but hopefully some people might watch this, be inspired, and reach out. And I know I'm interested in potentially collaborating, and MACNA might be interested in collaborating with you on the future. So hopefully we can get a larger survey or more information out of the general aquarium public in the future.
That's great. And if any students or honestly, anybody, if you have any questions, please do ask them, because I can at least point you in the right direction. I like to mentor people and help them, get to the next step in their life career, whatever that may be. So feel free, please, to ask.
Thank you, Liz, for speaking at MACNA 2020 Phoenix Rising.
Thanks, Kevin, for having me.